Carmen Rodriguez had been invisible for 4 years, just another waitress serving $1,000 dinners to people who never looked her twice. But tonight everything changed. She was pouring water for Alexander Vaughn, the billionaire CEO who came every Tuesday night, when her eyes caught something on his documents. A signature, an elegant, unmistakable handwriting she hadn't seen in 15 years. The same handwriting that used to sign her birthday cards. The same handwriting that used to be on her school permission slips. It was her father's signature. Michael Rodriguez, the man her mother told her died in a car accident when she was 8 years old. But this signature was dated 3 months ago. Carmen's hand started trembling. Her father wasn't dead, he was alive. And somehow this billionaire sitting in front of her had documents with his name on them. What Carmen didn't know yet was that Alexander's father had destroyed hers. That the empire she was serving was built on stolen dreams, and a betrayal so deep it had torn her family apart. But what happened when she whispered to Alexander, "That's my father's signature, he's supposed to be dead?" His reaction changed everything. Because sometimes the person sitting at table 8 isn't just a customer. Sometimes they're the key to a 15-year-old mystery that's about to explode. Carmen Rodriguez had just finished pouring water into the glass of the restaurant's wealthiest customer when she saw something that made her hands tremble. On the document spread open in front of him was a signature she had known since childhood, a handwriting she had seen 1,000 times on birthday cards and school notes. Alexander Vaughn, the multimillionaire CEO who dined every night at the Meadow in Manhattan, was studying contracts signed by her father, a man Carmen had believed dead for 15 years after mysteriously disappearing when she was only 8 years old. But what she discovered in the following minutes would shake both their lives. Her father hadn't died. He had been betrayed by his own business partner. And that partner was precisely Alexander's father, who had built his empire on stolen projects and the ruin of the Rodriguez family. Now Carmen was serving $1,000 dinners to the heir of the man who had destroyed her family, unaware that tonight, destiny was about to deliver justice in the most unexpected way. Carmen Rodriguez had learned long ago to be invisible. At 23 years old, after serving tables at the Meadow restaurant for 4 years, she had perfected the art of moving among wealthy customers without ever drawing attention. She was just the waitress who carried expensive dishes and served select wines to people who spent in one night what she earned in a month. That October evening, New York City was wrapped in a fine rain that made the Manhattan lights even more alluring. The Meadow was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, frequented by businessmen, politicians, and movie stars. Carmen worked there Monday through Saturday from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., earning barely enough to support herself through architecture school and help her mother with rent. Alexander Vaughn sat at table number 8, the corner table with a view of Central Park, reserved only for the most important clients. At 42 years old, he was the CEO of Vaughn Holdings, an empire spanning from construction to new technologies. Forbes had included him among America's 50 richest men, with an estimated net worth of over $2 billion. Carmen knew him well, at least by sight. He came every Tuesday night, always alone, always impeccable in his suit. He invariably ordered the same menu: prime rib, Maine lobster risotto, roasted rack of lamb. He never talked on the phone during dinner, never smiled. He seemed to carry on his shoulders the weight of enormous responsibilities. That night, however, something was different. Instead of his usual Wall Street journal, Alexander had opened a folder of documents on the white tablecloth. Carmen approached with her usual discretion to serve the water. When her gaze fell upon the papers scattered before him, her heart stopped in her throat. At the bottom of one of the contracts, written in that elegant and unmistakable handwriting that had accompanied her childhood, was the signature of Michael Rodriguez, her father. The water pitcher began to tremble in her hands. Michael Rodriguez, the man Carmen had believed dead for 15 years, the one her mother had told her had disappeared in a car accident when she was 8 years old. The signature was recent, dated just 3 months earlier. Carmen tried to maintain her composure while serving the water, but her eyes remained fixed on those documents. She couldn't be mistaken. She had seen that signature on hundreds of greeting cards, on school notes, on field trip permission slips. Alexander looked up, noticing that the waitress had remained motionless longer than usual. He looked at her for the first time, really looked, noticing her wide green eyes and the paleness that had covered her face. When he asked if everything was all right, Carmen managed to stammer that signature belonged to her father. Alexander looked at her confused, then lowered his eyes to the documents. When Carmen pointed trembling at the name Michael Rodriguez, explaining that he should have been dead for 15 years, Alexander's reaction was instantaneous. He tensed in his chair. His eyes became suddenly alert and cautious. The name Michael Rodriguez was not unknown in the history of Vaughn Holdings. It was the name of a ghost his father had always avoided mentioning. Alexander abruptly closed the folder, gathering the documents with quick, nervous movements. His face had become an impenetrable mask, but Carmen managed to catch something in his eyes. Surprise, concern, and perhaps also fear. He said he had an urgent commitment. He left two $50 bills on the table and headed toward the exit with rapid steps. Carmen stood there with the water pitcher still in her hand, watching him disappear into the Manhattan night. That night, she couldn't finish her shift with the same concentration as always. She kept thinking about Alexander's reaction, about the way he had closed those documents, about the hurry with which he had left, and above all, she kept thinking about that signature identical to the one she remembered from her childhood. Returning home on the last subway to Queens, Carmen knew her life was about to change. She didn't yet know how, but she had the certainty that tonight she had opened a door to the past that someone had tried to keep closed for 15 years. Alexander couldn't sleep that night. In his penthouse overlooking Central Park, he paced back and forth through the living room with his father's documents spread across the mahogany desk. The name Michael Rodriguez echoed in his mind like an echo from a past he thought buried forever. When he had inherited the company upon his father's death 8 years earlier, Alexander had found among the personal papers a folder marked Confidential, IMSAR. Inside were contracts, patents, architectural projects of great value. His father had always told him they were regular acquisitions. Partnerships concluded in the 90s. But that night, looking into the green eyes of that waitress, Alexander had seen something that had shaken him. The same determination, the same intelligence that showed through in the projects signed by Michael Rodriguez. The next day, Alexander canceled all his appointments and locked himself in his office. He called Marcus Thompson, the private detective he used for the company's most delicate matters, requesting an exhaustive investigation into Michael Rodriguez, an architect who disappeared about 15 years ago. Meanwhile, Carmen had spent the day in a state of growing agitation. She couldn't concentrate in her university classes. She kept thinking about that signature and Alexander's reaction. She had tried to talk to her mother, but Lisa Rodriguez had always avoided discussing the past, saying that Michael had died in an accident and that it was better not to reopen old wounds. That night, Carmen arrived at the restaurant an hour early. She wanted to be sure she was there when Alexander arrived. She had 1,000 questions to ask him, and this time she wouldn't be intimidated by the social difference that separated them. But Alexander didn't show up. Table number 8 remained empty all night, and Carmen found herself serving other customers with her mind elsewhere. 3 days later, as Carmen was leaving Columbia University after an architectural design class, she found a black Mercedes with dark windows waiting for her. The rear window rolled down, revealing the face of Alexander Vaughn. Carmen hesitated, then got into the car. The interior was luxurious: beige leather, precious wood, the scent of expensive masculine fragrances. Alexander sat in the opposite corner, dressed in a gray Armani suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. Alexander opened a folder and extracted a series of documents: photos, newspaper articles, certificates. Carmen saw her father's face, younger than she remembered, smiling next to a man it took her a moment to recognize. It was Frank Vaughn, Alexander's father. In the photo, they were shaking hands in front of a construction site entrance, smiling, and apparently on excellent terms. The date on the back indicated May 1994. Alexander began to tell the story he had reconstructed. Michael Rodriguez had been a brilliant architect specializing in sustainable construction projects, very advanced for his time. In 1994, he had established a partnership with Frank Vaughn to develop revolutionary residential complexes, but Frank Vaughn was a greedy and unscrupulous man. When he realized the value of Michael's projects, he began maneuvering to exclude his partner. He forged documents, bribed city officials, put Michael in a position where it appeared he had violated building codes. Michael found himself involved in an investigation for construction fraud and bribery. The evidence was false, but it seemed true. The district attorney opened an investigation. The New York Times began talking about a corrupt architect who had built buildings outside of code. Alexander showed Carmen the last photo. A man with gray hair, his face marked by fatigue, working at a construction site. It was clearly Michael Rodriguez, but aged and changed by suffering. He lived in Phoenix. He worked as a laborer for a construction company. He had changed his name. He called himself Michael Martinez. Her mother had believed it was better to tell her he had died, rather than explain that he had been forced to flee to avoid prison. Carmen burst into tears. 15 years of mourning, of growing up without a father, of believing herself an orphan, and all because of one man's greed who had wanted to appropriate her father's genius. When she asked why he was revealing all this to her, Alexander looked at her with eyes in which Carmen saw vulnerability and humanity for the first time. When he had inherited his father's company, he had also inherited his crimes, and he understood that she had the right to know the truth. Carmen didn't return to work for 3 days. She remained locked in her room processing the truth that Alexander had revealed to her. Her mother initially denied everything, but faced with the evidence of the proofs, she confessed through tears. Michael hadn't died. He had been forced to flee to escape the investigation orchestrated by Frank Vaughn. She had only wanted to protect Carmen, too young to understand that her father had become a fugitive. Carmen was devastated. 15 years of lies. 15 years in which she could have had a father. But the rage toward her mother was nothing compared to what she felt toward the Vaughn family. On the 4th day, Alexander showed up at her apartment in Queens in the rain. His expensive Tom Ford suit soaked. He wanted to make amends, to return to her father what had been stolen from him. He showed Carmen a folder with legal documents and financial calculations. He had estimated the value of the stolen projects, $50 million. His plan included a press conference to reveal the truth, rehabilitate Michael, and offer him a position as creative director. When Carmen asked why he should do all this, Alexander explained that he couldn't live knowing his wealth was built on a crime, and that since he had met her, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Carmen noticed that Alexander was no longer the cold man from the restaurant. He was vulnerable, tormented, determined to do the right thing despite the risks. If he really wanted to make amends, he had to take her to her father. Alexander nodded without hesitation. The next day, boarding the private jet headed to Phoenix, Carmen understood she was beginning a journey that would change everything. The Tempe construction site. On the outskirts of Phoenix was a dusty and noisy place where dozens of workers labored under the burning Arizona sun. Alexander and Carmen arrived in an Uber that contrasted with the luxury Alexander was accustomed to, but he had insisted on not drawing attention. Carmen saw her father before he noticed her. Michael Rodriguez, now called Michael Martinez, was directing a group of workers in the installation of a crane. At 52 years old, he was still the tall and distinguished man Carmen remembered, but his hair had turned gray and his face was marked by lines of fatigue. He wore work overalls stained with cement and had a yellow hard hat on his head. His hands, which Carmen remembered as always clean and precise while drawing blueprints, were now calloused and dirty from manual labor. When Michael looked up and saw her, time seemed to stop. The hard hat fell from his hands, his eyes filled with tears, and for a moment it seemed he was going to faint. Carmen ran toward him, and when they embraced, both burst into tears. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. 15 years of separation, of pain, of misunderstandings dissolved in that embrace that seemed like it should never end. The construction workers had stopped to watch this moving scene, not understanding what was happening. Alexander remained apart, respecting the private moment between father and daughter, but at the same time feeling guilty for being the indirect cause of that separation. After the first moments of emotion, Michael noticed Alexander and his face became distrustful. When Carmen explained who he was, Michael immediately tensed. The name Vaughn awakened in him painful memories, rage and resentment he had tried to bury for 15 years. Alexander approached, removing his Ray-Bans and looking Michael in the eyes, explaining that he had come to ask forgiveness for what his father had done, and to try to repair the damage. Michael studied him carefully. He saw in Alexander some features of Frank, but also something different, a sincerity his father had never had. They went to talk at a Denny's near the construction site. Michael had changed, putting on a clean polo shirt, but Carmen noticed how uncomfortable he felt, far from his work environment. 15 years of life in hiding had changed him, made him more cautious, less trusting. Alexander explained his entire plan: public rehabilitation, financial compensation, job offer. Michael listened in silence, occasionally looking at Carmen as if to make sure it wasn't all a dream. When Michael asked why he should trust him, Alexander responded firmly that he was not his father, and that he had Carmen, who would never allow him to hurt them. Michael looked at his daughter, seeing in her the strong and determined woman she had become despite everything. When Carmen asked him what he thought, he remained silent for long minutes, staring at his hands ruined by manual labor. He explained that the worst part of those 15 years hadn't been the poverty or the fatigue, but knowing that somewhere his daughter was growing up without him and not being able to do anything to help her. If he accepted Alexander's proposal, he wasn't doing it for himself, but for Carmen, so she could have the future she deserved, the one he had never managed to give her. That night, in a small Marriott in Phoenix, Carmen and Michael talked for hours. He told her about the years of fleeing, about how he had had to start from zero, about how much he had missed her every day. She told him about her life, her studies, the pain of growing up without a father. Alexander left them alone, going to walk through downtown Phoenix. He had obtained what he wanted. Michael had accepted his proposal. But he realized that this was only the beginning. Publicly rehabilitating Michael meant admitting that the Vaughn empire was built on a fraud. But looking at Carmen embrace her father, Alexander understood it was worth it, not only for justice, but because he had found a reason to be a better man than his father. The press conference was organized in the conference hall of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. Alexander had invited America's most important business journalists, institutional representatives, and all the main competitors in the construction sector. He knew what he was about to say would cause a sensation and would forever change the perception of Vaughn Holdings. Carmen sat in the front row next to her father, who for the occasion had put on one of his old Brooks Brothers suits. After 15 years of work overalls, he felt strange in a jacket and tie, but Carmen had told him it was important for the world to see him for what he had always been, a brilliant architect. Alexander went up to the podium with the documents under his arm and his heart beating fast. He had prepared the speech for days, but now, looking at Michael and Carmen, he felt he should speak with his heart more than his head. He began to tell the whole story: how his father, Frank Vaughn, had met Michael Rodriguez, how he had stolen his projects, how he had orchestrated his ruin to appropriate his genius. He showed the original documents, proof of the forgeries, testimonies from witnesses who were finally willing to speak. The room was in absolute silence. Journalists took notes frantically. Cameras recorded every word. Alexander was publicly admitting that his family's empire was built on a crime. He officially announced that Michael Rodriguez would become creative director of Vaughn Holdings, with a contract guaranteeing him 5% of all the company's future profits. Additionally, he would receive compensation of $50 million for the damages suffered. But the biggest surprise was still to come. Alexander announced that he had decided to cede 40% of the company's shares to Michael Rodriguez and his daughter Carmen. A murmur of surprise went through the room. Alexander was giving away almost half of his company to the people his father had ruined. Michael stood up and approached the microphone. For the first time in 15 years, he could speak publicly with his real name. He explained that Frank Vaughn hadn't only stolen his projects, but also his family, his dignity, his life. Today, Alexander had had the courage to admit the truth and to repair the damage. But the most important thing he had recovered wasn't the money or the work. It was his daughter. And for that, he would always be grateful to Alexander Vaughn. The press conference made all the evening news broadcasts. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC headlines talked about the CEO who renounces his fortune for justice and the greatest reparation in American business history. That night, Alexander, Carmen, and Michael dined together at the Meadow, the same restaurant where it had all begun. Carmen no longer wore the waitress uniform, but an elegant blue Diane von Furstenberg dress that Alexander had given her. Michael, after 15 years, could finally afford to eat at one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants. Michael raised his wine glass for a toast, to justice that always arrives, even if sometimes it takes 15 years. As they toasted, Alexander looked at Carmen and saw in her eyes something that went beyond gratitude. There was affection, admiration, and perhaps something deeper. When Alexander said he had to go to Paris for an important contract and asked Carmen to accompany him, not as an employee but as a partner, and perhaps something more, Carmen blushed. In just a few days, this man had completely changed her life. Michael looked at his daughter and Alexander and smiled. 15 years of suffering finally seemed to have made sense. From evil had been born something beautiful, not only justice, but also love. Months after the press conference that had shaken the American business world, Vaughn Holdings had become a completely different company. Michael Rodriguez had revolutionized the project approach, introducing sustainable technologies and innovative designs that had already become a model for the entire sector. Carmen had left Colombia to dedicate herself completely to the family business, demonstrating she had inherited not only her father's intelligence, but also a natural talent for business. Her first proposal, transforming old warehouses in Brooklyn into sustainable loft complexes, had secured contracts worth over $100 million. Alexander had maintained his position as CEO, but now shared every important decision with Michael and Carmen. Their collaboration had become perfect. Michael brought creativity and technical innovation. Carmen brought energy and fresh ideas. Alexander brought managerial experience and international contacts. But the most important transformation was personal. Alexander and Carmen had become inseparable, and their professional relationship had evolved into something much deeper. They worked together during the day and spent evenings planning future projects, visiting construction sites, dreaming of more beautiful and sustainable cities. One spring evening, Alexander took Carmen to the terrace of his penthouse. Manhattan stretched out at their feet, illuminated by the nightlights, with the Empire State Building shining like a beacon in the city center. Alexander pointed to an area of the city, explaining it was their next project. 500 sustainable condos in Hudson Yards, with vertical gardens and solar panels. Michael had already made the first sketches. But what he wanted to tell her was something else. She had become the most important thing in his life, more important than the company, more important than money, more important than everything. He took out a small Tiffany blue box. Inside was an engagement ring with a diamond that reflected the city lights. Carmen looked at him with eyes shining with tears of happiness. She thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought them there, from waitress and customer in a luxury restaurant to fiancé who were about to become husband and wife. She accepted to marry the man who had had the courage to recognize his father's mistakes and to repair the damages. The man who had given her back her family. The wedding was celebrated 3 months later in the garden of the new estate they had bought together in the Hamptons. Michael walked Carmen down the aisle, proud to finally be present at the most important moment of his daughter's life. Lisa, Carmen's mother, cried with joy, seeing her family finally reunited and happy. She had forgiven Alexander for his father's sins, seeing the sincere love he felt for Carmen and the respect he showed toward Michael. During the ceremony, Alexander and Carmen exchanged rings and promises of love. But above all, they exchanged the promise to continue together the work of reconstruction they had begun. Not only of the company, but of a new way of doing business based on honesty, innovation, and social responsibility. The first project they signed as husband and wife was the construction of a training center for young architects and engineers. The building would be dedicated to Frank Vaughn, not to honor his crimes, but to remember that even from the mistakes of the past, one can learn and build a better future. Michael became the director of the center. His first lecture was dedicated to the importance of professional ethics and the value of always making the right choice, even when it's difficult. 1 year after the wedding, Carmen gave birth to a baby girl they named Sophia. When Michael held his granddaughter in his arms for the first time, Carmen saw in his eyes the same tenderness she remembered from her childhood. Alexander had become not only a loving husband, but also an adopted son to Michael. That night in their new townhouse in the Upper West Side, while Sophia slept in her nursery and Michael leafed through photo albums recovering all the lost memories, Alexander and Carmen sat on the terrace looking at the stars. Carmen thought about how sometimes destiny has strange ways of fixing things, Who would have said that a signature on a contract in a restaurant would have changed all their lives? Alexander kissed her sweetly. Destiny had made them meet, but it had been they who chose to do the right thing. And they would continue choosing good every day for the rest of their lives. Looking at Manhattan, which shone in the night with their company's works building a better future, they knew they had found much more than they had dreamed. They had found love, family, and the certainty that even from the greatest pain, something beautiful can emerge. Because sometimes, all it takes is the courage of a waitress who recognizes her father's signature, and the honesty of a CEO who decides to repair the sins of the past to change the destiny of many lives and prove that justice, even if it arrives late, always arrives. Like if you believe it's never too late to repair the mistakes of the past. Comment which moment of the story impacted you most. Share to inspire those who believe truth always defeats lies. Subscribe for more stories of justice, love, and second chances. Sometimes all it takes is recognizing a signature to change a family's destiny. Sometimes it takes courage to admit mistakes and become the right man. And sometimes love is born just when you least expect it, in the most difficult moment. Because true wealth isn't what you inherit, but what you build with honesty and love.